Aryeh Lightstone, great to be with you. You were a special advisor to the former U.S. Ambassador David Friedman, Special Envoy about the Abraham Accords, and now you've written a new book called Let My People Know, as opposed to Let My People Go.
That's right.
And the incredible story of Middle East peace and what lies ahead. Tell us what the book's about.
Well, the book is exactly what the title says, Let My People Know. I had the unique opportunity to sit here with Ambassador Friedman, and you know, we spent some time together day in, day out, and watch him, on behalf of President Trump, elevate the U.S.-Israel relationship. And that got a fair amount of attention, whether it was the recognition of Jerusalem, the moving of the embassy, the recognition of the Golan Heights, lots of various different prominent decisions that strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. And then the Abraham Accords break out. They break out on August 13th, 2020. And maybe the word breakout is wrong, as though they just happened out of nowhere. They happened because of brilliant diplomacy led by Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and others. And from August 13th, 2020, when the first phone call happened in the Oval Office and between President Trump, then Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and then Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, to begin normalization between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, over the next 123 days, 5 different major peace agreements were signed, and nobody knows about it. This is peace in the Middle East, and people don't know about it. So I was in the room, so I wanted to let people know how exciting this was.
You were in the room. What did you hear in the room? What was going on in the room?
So the very first time that I was in a room for the Abraham Accords with the president was on August 13, 2020 at that phone call. And like any other phone call that we have on a conference call, people talk over each other, right? There's, can you hear me? And somebody has to repeat it again. You would think in the Oval Office, perhaps the technology would be slightly different, but like any other conference call, it had that very human moment. And then after the phone call where Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed said something very profound, he said, in the middle of COVID, if you remember August of 2020, it feels like everything is happening to us. We're reacting. And as leaders, it's tough to be in a position of always reacting. This is a moment to be proactive. And we're going to make a Middle East that is not determined based upon what it was. We're going to build a Middle East based upon what it can and should be. And I'll remember those words forever, because he didn't need to do this, right? He took a risk. Normalizing with Israel and the Muslim Arab world hadn't happened for 25 years from any meaningful country. He is extremely well thought of in the Muslim Arab world, and he took a risk to say we will normalize with Israel. And it's not just normalize, we will embrace the relationship with Israel. And at that point in time, the president hangs up the phone, and there's just silence in the room, because maybe 40 people knew about this prior to the phone call in the entire world, including all the Emiratis, all the Israelis, all the Americans. Maybe 45 people knew. And the phone call ends, and there's sort of this moment. And Steven Mnuchin, the former Secretary of the Treasury, leaps out of his chair and leads a round of applause. There are no cameras in the room. There's no video in the room. But there was this acknowledgement that there was this moment where the world changed based upon this phone call, and my heart still leaps every time I think of that moment when Mnuchin jumps up and everybody joins in this round of applause in the Oval Office, and it was just incredibly uplifting.
How did this change the whole region?
Well, if you look at what John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, said in December of 2016, he was very adamant about no, no, no. And what does no, no, no mean? No, no, no means that no Arab country will further their relationship with Israel until you resolve the challenge with the Palestinians. And basically what that meant was, from the Secretary of State of the United States of America, is that the region will be handcuffed or paralyzed until we're able to cram a 2-state solution down the throat of the Israelis. This had been tried for better than 20 years. The only success of this had been death and destruction and terrorism, and it was again doubled and tripled and quadrupled down by the Secretary of State. And there are 2 superpowers that exist in the Middle East. There's Israel's relationship with the United States, and there was the Arab boycott that the Palestinians were able to leverage. And when the United States openly agreed with that Arab boycott, which is what John Kerry did by saying no, 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 then you wound up with a region that was going to be stuck and paralyzed. What President Trump, Ambassador Friedman, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, Secretary Mike Pompeo, all of your people, right, were what they did is they said, no, we're not going to be ambiguous. We're not going to try to placate both Israel and the Arab world, we're going to act in America's interest. And America's interest is to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's to move our embassy to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. It's to move our ambassadors home to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. It's to recognize the sovereignty of the Golan Heights, etc., etc., etc. And when that happened, the other countries looked and said, wait, Israel's not an anomaly. It's not an exception. It's not disappearing. The United States, the superpower, is standing with it unequivocally. We need to now change what we're going to do. And they said, we'll stand with Israel too. We won't agree with everything Israel does, which is fine. Nobody agrees with everything that anybody else does, unless you're speaking to my wife, right? So what is that? They were willing to go ahead and change that, and the whole dynamic shifted. Now the Arab world, especially the most advanced and modern countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, said we want to be closer with Israel. That changes the entire equation, and the Middle East can now be a place of peace and prosperity.
So you basically took away the veto that the Palestinian Authority had over many of these Arab nations.
Yeah, I'd like to say I took it away, but Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed with his dear friend Jared Kushner and obviously President Trump decided that the region is going to be paralyzed. The Palestinians are not willing or capable of taking the next step, and therefore if they're not going to take the next step, somebody has to. And the UAE took that next step to say the region is going to be different. The region is going to be better.
So you basically went contrary to conventional wisdom, epitomized by the former Secretary John Kerry, and you went a whole different path.
Yeah.
And many people thought it was going to be World War III when you moved the embassy here to Jerusalem. So you were really going against a lot of pushback, I guess, headwinds against what you were trying to do diplomatically.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump deserves all the credit because he took all the risk. On December 6, 2017, when he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, you exactly said it correctly. People thought mayhem and catastrophes were going to occur that very day. And when nothing happened, you know what happened? None of the experts said we were wrong. None of the experts who predicted death and destruction said, oh, maybe we got this wrong. They then said, oh, no, it'll happen when you open up the embassy. Just 6 months later, on May 14th, 2018. And when nothing happened on May 14th or 15th or 16th or 17th, the experts still didn't say, maybe we got it wrong. And this expert class continues to be able to say that they're experts, but what are they experts in? And so therefore it was this unconventional group led by President Trump, an unconventional president, led by his son-in-law Jared Kushner, David Friedman, Avi Berkowitz, all unconventional people. And all they did was deal with the Middle East as a normal person would deal with it and said, this is how we can move things forward. And just because the experts said it didn't work didn't mean that people with common sense knew that it could.
Yeah, part of your subtitle says, what lies ahead in the Middle East? What do you think lies ahead? And let me ask you first, where did you leave the Middle East when the Trump administration left office?
Yeah, so let's talk about the Middle East when he walked into office. ISIS was on the Syrian border, not just on the Syrian border, it had a caliphate roughly the size of the state of Ohio. It was running rampant, right? Syria was Syria. Iran was marching steadily towards a nuclear weapon. Iraq was Iraq. Yemen was with the Houthis. The region was a mess. And then President Trump left the region, right? In January of 2021, there was no more ISIS. Syria had a form of stability, not a great stability, but still a form of stability. Iran was at this point in time at the weakest it had ever been economically. Iran's foreign policy was hope Biden wins, right? That is the foreign policy of an adversary of ours. That should tell us everything that we need to know. The Houthis had been minimized and were on the terror watch list. And Israel, our number one ally in the region, had just become part of 5 separate peace agreements with countries that matter meaningfully in the region. Had we just continued that roadmap, you would see 10 other countries on, and likely Iran trying to figure out how they can sue Israel for peace as opposed to the opposite. The region would be different.
So here we are 18 months after the inauguration of President Joe Biden. He's just finished a trip both here to Israel and to Saudi Arabia. Where are we at now?
Yeah, so in this region, David Friedman would always say, if you're not strong, you're dead. Which is correct. If you're not strong, you're dead. I would like to add a statement to that I've seen to be very true. If you're not clear, you cause chaos. And with President Trump, there was clarity. There was, we stand with Israel. There's, we stand against Iran. We stand against radical Islam. We embrace modern Islam. These are America's values, and this was said unambiguously and very clearly. And then every other country knew where we stood, so they made their decisions, amongst them the Abraham Accords. President Biden shows up, and I root for him. When the president does well, America does well. But these are misguided policies. The run back to the Iran deal sheds confusion. Why are we embracing a country that took the money that we gave them to cause more terrorism? Why do we think that anything is going to change? If anything, they've become more hardened, not more civilized. We want to go ahead and re-elevate the Palestinian people. President Biden went to East Jerusalem, removed the flag of Israel from his limo, from the beast, and gave money to the Palestinian Authority that still has a law on its books that incentivizes terrorists to kill Israelis. So this sows confusion. In the interest of saying we want equity, we want everybody to be equal in the region, we've now stopped picking sides. We've now stopped favoring our friends and threatening our enemies, and we said, we're just sort of going to be here. When that happens, you have chaos and confusion, and we're looking at a region that I'm a little bit concerned for today, certainly much more concerned than I was just 18 months ago.
There's a concept in the Middle East about a strong horse. You know, people follow a strong horse, somebody that projects strength. Tell us about what that concept is and how does it work here in the Middle East?
Yeah, no, you're exactly correct. Either you're strong or you die. In order to be able to project power, hopefully not ever have to use it, it has to be clear that you're capable of using it, and at that moment you would use it. And this is what happens with Israel. Israel would take incoming from Gaza or from Hezbollah or wherever else it would be. Israel has made no secret of the fact that it will not allow additional Iranian weapons on its border, and it's not confirmed, but it seems to be fairly well reported that Israel is taking care of that almost nightly in Syria. Israel has not only the ability, but the desire, and at least reported historically the success of making sure that those weapons don't wind up further on its border. Contrast that with the Houthis firing missiles into Saudi and into the UAE. And where was the United States of America when this happened just months ago? We weren't out there with condemnation. We weren't out there with support. We weren't out there with missile defense. Israel was. We weren't. And because we weren't, the Saudis and the Emiratis and others have to be questioning where the United States of America will be when the chips are down. Not only that, but we removed the Houthis from our terror list, and there was at least an active conversation whether we want to remove the IRGC, the actual terror body of Iran, from our terror list. That's confusion. That is not a strong horse. That is a horse that reaches a fork in the road and sits down because it doesn't know which way to go. Nobody follows that horse because that horse doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Two questions. On the eve, or actually when President Biden was visiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE made an announcement that they were going to maybe send an ambassador to Tehran. What kind of signal does that send?
It sends a signal of there's no strong horse that's leading. And at this point in time, every country in the region has to do what's in their best interest. We had an America First policy. I'm not positive what our policy is right now, but it's not America First. UAE has a UAE First policy. They know that they need to take care of their people. It's a terrifying region when there's not a strong horse. And my assumption is they're exploring what is best for their people right now. I'm convinced, based upon historic precedents, it's not enhancing friendliness with Iran. Right now, I assume that they are there because there's no other alternative right now other than to explore what that would ultimately look like.
So are they afraid the U.S. is not going to have their back like the Trump administration had?
Oh, I mean, it's incredibly clear that the U.S. and under this administration is not standing strong with our allies in the region, not with the UAE and not with Saudi. We've seen the proof in the pudding. When missiles are shot and we're not there to protect our allies at that first moment, they obviously have to be concerned about what would wind up happening. And the second thing is actively negotiating with the Iran deal. Do you know who one of our interlocutors is at that Iran negotiation? The Russians. Explain to me where Russians are allowed today in polite society. Not somebody who has a Russian last name, not somebody of Russian heritage, but a Russian official of Putin's government is one of our interlocutors for our deal with Iran. I think we should stop calling it the Iran deal, should call it the Russia deal, and then the United States of America in a bipartisan fashion will reject it. We don't negotiate with the Russians anywhere else. We're negotiating with them here with Iran.
There was talk about a regional infrastructure between Israel, maybe the UAE, Bahrain, maybe Saudi Arabia to some extent. Has that sort of dissipated after Biden's trip?
I think the public descriptions of that are going to go underground for a little bit. I think that you have security and defense, which are normally conversations that are better kept quiet. Those conversations are likely still percolating because the threat is still very significant. But again, when you want to project power, it's not a question of using the power. It's people knowing you have the power. The United States of America should, and they have on a couple of occasions in the last 6 months, be bringing all of our allies together in the region and saying, what will we do in order to enhance our security together? And those are great steps. But if you don't back up those steps with the correct wording about Iran, the correct Iran deal, then all you're doing is giving the disease to the region and maybe coming up with something that resembles the medicine also. Nobody wants to take the medicine. Eliminate the disease. Don't infect the region, just eliminate the disease, and then you don't need to worry about these things. And the best thing that you can do is if you demonstrate that the region is strong, led by the United States of America, you don't need to worry about it because we are the true superpower.
My understanding is that now the State Department is bringing not only within the Abraham Accords, the Palestinian Authority, Qatar, and Jordan. What impact does this have on the Abraham Accords, and does it threaten the Abraham Accords?
I'd like to think that the Abraham Accords are going to be something that our grandchildren are going to be talking to each other about, because I have so much faith in these countries that they are going to lead this region into a better place, that I think they'll do it, in this case, maybe despite or in spite of now U.S. meddling with the Abraham Accords. To introduce the Palestinians, the Jordanians, here's my feeling. This is a region about the future. If the Jordanians and the Palestinians want to show up and talk about the future, they should be invited with open arms. Anybody who wants to talk about making this region more peaceful and more prosperous, please come. Anybody who wants to litigate historical wrongs or historical narratives or whatever else it will be a cold towel on the Abraham Accords, and people are going to then be sitting around the table and saying, well, where are you on this political issue? Nothing gets done when you talk about political issues. Let's talk about how we progress the region. How does the region come up with a comprehensive response to a pandemic, if God forbid another pandemic comes? How do they come up with a comprehensive response to missile defense, which is critical for the region? How do they come up with comprehensive response to be able to make the movement of oil and gas cheaper in this region? That won't only strengthen this region, but it'll strengthen the entire world. Or we could talk about where that Jew should live or where that Palestinian should live. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that and not getting anything done.
So, subtitle, what lies ahead? Now that you see we're 18 months into the Biden administration, we're looking at 2022 midterms, 2024. Not necessarily a political analysis, but what do you see for the region?
Yeah, so for the region, what lies ahead, I think, are two different things. Number one is the question of peace in the region is a question of when and not if. I think when John Kerry began with no, 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 the answer today is yes, yes, yes. Now the question is when. And that will have to deal with whether the United States of America wants to lead on this or it wants to follow. President Biden flew directly from Israel to Saudi Arabia. And a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my friends, a lot of my mentors said it's no big deal. And the answer is, you're right, it isn't that big of a deal. President Trump flew the opposite way just 5 years prior. That was a big deal. That was the first time it had ever happened. I've flown dozens of times over Saudi, to UAE, to Bahrain, etc. But the fact that Biden took a step forward is far better than going a mile backwards. And if you look at the rest of the policies that they seem determined to reverse, whether it's energy independence, right, whether it's the Houthis on the terror list, whether it's re-engaging with Iran, those are all ridiculous reversals. So here, if they're willing to take a step forward, I'll celebrate that step forward, and I hope that that 1 inch will demonstrate some success, and they'll take another step, and they'll take another step. And I said this every day for 123 days. The Abraham Accords or peace in the Middle East is not a Republican initiative. It's not a Democratic initiative. It's an American value. And every American should stand for this. And when we don't, I think we have to question how supportive we are of American values.
Yeah. Final question, and any other thoughts you may have. Right now we have a scenario where we seem to have a stronger Iran, a weaker Abraham Accords, at least temporarily. The Sunni Arab nations may be tilting towards Iran. You have Israel saying they won't allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Are we heading towards a confrontation here in the region?
I certainly hope not. I think what has been demonstrated is that because Israel has both the will and the ability to act, the rest of the countries in the region, especially Iran, knows that. And now there's a game of chicken, and that's obviously diminishing what the actual stakes are over here. But here's what's important to know. Russia is operating now with impunity because they have a nuclear umbrella. They have nukes, and therefore what the free world can do to stop Russia is limited based upon not wanting to elevate this issue. Russia, just a couple years ago, was considered a fairly rational state actor. The Iranians since 1979 have not been considered a rational state actor. Imagine an irrational state actor with a nuclear umbrella, what they would be capable of doing. This is not a Republican issue. This is not a Democratic issue. This is a free world issue. And the United States of America needs to say incredibly clearly, we will stand with Israel, we will stand with our allies, and we will defeat our enemies. We are the superpower. If we put our mind to it, we absolutely can bring them to our knees without firing a single shot. We have the ability to win in the boardroom, so we don't need to win on the battlefield. We need to understand how to use our leverage, and right now they're not using it.
Yeah. Well, Aryeh Lightstone, thanks for your insight analysis in your new book, Let My People Know. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.